some mysteries are staged not in darkness, but beneath the brightest lights. This tale begins at the Strand Theatre, where vanished daggers, whispered threats, and a locked dressing room conjure the illusion of the impossible, until Holmes turns illusion into revelation. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us draw back the curtain and step into the drama where theatre and crime meet. It was upon a night of singular stillness, when the fog had lifted from the river and a thin moon glimmered through ragged clouds, that Holmes and I sat in our rooms at Baker Street. My companion was sunk deep in an armchair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, while I occupied myself with a medical journal whose dull text was scarcely sufficient to keep me awake. The hour was late. Indeed, Big Ben had just struck 12, when the silence of our vigil was shattered by a hurried rap at the door. It was no ordinary summons, but sharp, insistent, and strangely urgent, as though the visitor trembled even while knocking. Holmes raised his eyebrows in swift interest. "You will admit, Watson," he murmured, "that the rhythm is feminine, yet the tempo of one pursued." Before I could fashion a reply, Mrs. Hudson, muffled in shawl and candlelight, entered to announce a lady most anxious for our aid, despite the untimely hour. Our visitor was ushered in without delay. She was tall and graceful, but her pallor, heightened by the wan glow of our lamp, lent her beauty a fragile and spectral air. Her gloved hands trembled as she drew back her veil, and I observed how her eyes darted nervously from shadow to shadow, as though she feared some unseen pursuer had followed her even into Holmes's sanctuary. Her gown, though of good taste, bore signs of haste. The hem was damp and clung with a trace of mud from the streets. "I crave your pardon, gentlemen," she began, her voice faltering. "But I had no choice. My life is in peril, and only your wisdom can preserve me." She sank into the chair Holmes indicated, pressing a hand to her throat as though to steady her breath. Holmes inclined his head with grave courtesy. "Compose yourself, madam. You are under my roof now, and no harm shall touch you. I beg you to give us your name and the nature of this distress." "I am Evelina Harcourt," she whispered, "an actress at the Strand Theatre. Strange happenings, cruel threats and worse, have driven me to desperation. If I remain silent, I shall not live to see another dawn." Miss Harcourt's voice gathered strength as she spoke, though her eyes betrayed the tremor of her soul. She told us how the Strand Theatre had been her world these past years, a place of splendour to the public eye, but behind its velvet curtains, a realm of shadows and jealousies. She painted for us a vivid sketch of that hidden life, the rehearsals filled with strife, the whispered intrigues of the dressing rooms, and the perpetual rivalry that gnawed at even the most seasoned performer. "There is glamour in abundance, Dr. Watson," she said with a wan smile, "but it is the sort that masks decay. Behind the applause lies envy, and behind the painted scenery, menace." Her words conjured before me the curious paradox of the stage, where illusion reigns supreme, and men and women wear masks not only for their audiences, but for one another. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes half closed, as though he saw not the lady before him, but the theatre itself, with all its shadowy recesses. "You hint, madam," he remarked softly, "that something darker than mere rivalry has intruded upon your company. Pray, tell us the precise nature of these disturbances." She drew from her reticule a small bundle of folded papers, their edges crumpled by repeated handling. "These were slipped into my dressing room," she explained, passing them to Holmes with a trembling hand. "Each bears no signature, yet the words chill the blood." I glanced at them. Terse warnings, penned in a hurried scrawl. "Leave the play or perish. The curtain shall fall upon your life as well as upon the act." One was no more than a slip of paper, bearing only a crude sketch of a dagger poised above a heart. "The first of these arrived a fortnight ago," Miss Harcourt continued, her voice low. "At first I dismissed it as some cruel jest, yet soon the whispers began. figures seen in the corridor where none should be, footsteps that halted when I turned, and a shadow that lingered behind the gauze of my dressing room screen. I have not known a moment's peace. Holmes studied the papers with keen interest, holding them delicately to the lamplight. "The handwriting is disguised," he murmured. "Yet disguise is but a mask, and every mask has its flaws." He laid them aside, his gaze intent upon her. "Continue, Miss Harcourt." She pressed a handkerchief to her lips before resuming. "It was during rehearsal yesterday that my greatest terror was kindled. Among the properties kept in the locked cupboard behind the stage is a dagger of unusual design, to be used in the final act. The armourer himself had placed it there, secure and counted among the rest. Yet when called for, it was gone. The company searched in vain, and all declared it had been mislaid. But I knew better." She clasped her hands tightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "That very night, when I returned to my dressing room, I found the dagger lying upon my table. The sight near robbed me of my senses. Yet when I called the stagehand and dared to show it, it had vanished once more, as though it had never been there. Watson though I am, accustomed to the horrors of war and practice, I confess a chill passed through me at this uncanny recital." Holmes, however, betrayed no emotion save an added keenness in his eyes. "An object locked away," he mused aloud, "yet found where no hand should place it. We deal, Watson, not with phantoms, but with one who knows both lock and key." Holmes rose, paced the room with measured tread, then resumed his seat, his gaze fixed keenly upon our visitor. "Miss Harcourt," he said at length, "allow me to observe. You came here in haste, yet your gloves are carefully matched. Your veil, though disarranged, is unstained by tear, and the mud upon your hem is of last night's fall, not of this evening's." She started slightly, colour touching her pale cheek, but Holmes did not elaborate. Instead, he posed but two questions, each more deliberate than the last. Was the dagger of steel or ornament? She replied it was tempered steel, dulled at the edge, yet still formidable. "And who possesses the key to the cupboard?" Her answer, "Only the manager, the armourer, and myself," brought no further comment from him. Watson-like, I longed to demand an explanation of his remarks, but Holmes fell again into silence, his eyes half closed as though communing with thoughts not for mortal sharing. Miss Harcourt sat nervously twisting her handkerchief, waiting as though for judgment. At length Holmes stirred, his tone gentler, though no less grave. "You have acted wisely in coming to me, Miss Harcourt. It is clear that some malignant intelligence works against you, employing both threat and contrivance to shake your composure. Rest assured, I shall attend to this matter." She rose with visible relief, though her fear had by no means left her. "Then you will come to the Strand?" she asked eagerly. Holmes inclined his head. "At dawn, we shall visit your theatre, and there I think we may find the first threads of the curtain that conceals your enemy." With that she departed into the night, Mrs. Hudson accompanying her to the waiting cab. I glanced at Holmes, who stood motionless at the window, gazing into the misty street below. "This case has gravity, Watson," he murmured at last. "The stage is but another world of masks, and where masks are worn, deception is at its boldest." The morning broke with a chill mist clinging heavily upon the streets, and the cab in which Holmes and I journeyed rolled slowly through the grey vapour that hung about the river and the narrow lanes adjoining. London wore that spectral aspect which lends itself so aptly to thoughts of intrigue and menace. Holmes, wrapped in his ulster and silent for most of the way, appeared absorbed in contemplation, his eyes fixed upon the shifting outlines beyond the carriage window. From time to time he tapped his long fingers upon his knee, as though keeping time with some inward train of logic. For myself, I confess that the case of Miss Harcourt had lodged uneasily in my mind, for her terror was genuine, and the mystery of the vanished dagger clung about me with a sense of the uncanny. When at last the looming facade of the Strand Theatre emerged from the fog, it seemed less a house of amusement than a stage, itself prepared for darker dramas. We were admitted by a porter who eyed us curiously, and passing down a narrow corridor, came suddenly into the vast emptiness of the theatre. The gaslights burned low, casting a wan gleam upon row after row of vacant seats, their velvet cushions dulled in the half-light. Upon the stage itself, a group of actors moved to and fro, rehearsing lines that rang hollow in the cavernous space, words of passion and betrayal echoing strangely from the bare rafters. The painted scenery hung askew upon its ropes, suggesting a dream half-finished and left in disorder. There was in the scene an air of unreality that weighed upon my senses, as though I had intruded into a shadow world where illusion and truth were not easily separated. Holmes, however, surveyed the stage with keen precision, his gaze moving from the actors to the loft above and down to the trap at our feet. "Observe, Watson," he whispered, "how many entrances and exits this stage affords, every one a possible path for mischief. I could not but agree that this theatre, which to the public promised delight, might to us prove a labyrinth of danger." We were soon introduced to certain members of the company whose varied temperaments struck me as curious enough to supply material for any number of melodramas. Foremost among them was the leading man, a figure of imposing stature with a voice trained to command. He greeted us with a flourish that seemed more suited to the footlights than to private discourse, and I thought I detected in his proud carriage a suggestion of vanity bordering upon conceit. The understudy, by contrast, presented a very different picture. A pale, nervous youth whose hands trembled as he clutched his script, and whose eyes shifted constantly towards Miss Harcourt, with an expression that mingled admiration with envy. Lastly, the manager, a harried gentleman with ink-stained cuffs and a brow furrowed deep by cares, seemed burdened with the weight of both art and finance. His every glance darted anxiously toward the stage, as though the very walls of his theatre threatened to betray him. I confess that, observing these three, I began to perceive how easily jealousies and passions might ferment in such a company, and how slender the line between stage rivalry and darker intentions. Holmes, with his customary dispassion, requested to be shown the workings of the stage itself. We were led by a stagehand into the recesses behind the curtain, where ropes dangled in thick profusion, pulleys creaked faintly above, and trapdoors yawned at irregular intervals in the floorboards. Dust lay upon much of the timber, and the air carried the mingled odours of grease paint, lamp oil, and ancient fabric. To me, the contrivances appeared bewildering, and I remarked upon the ingenuity by which entire worlds might be conjured before the eyes of an audience. Holmes, however, treated the scene not as marvel, but as opportunity for concealment and artifice. He stooped to examine a frayed cord, tested the hinge of a trap with the point of his stick, and measured with his keen eye the space beneath a shifting panel of scenery. "A stage, Watson," he observed dryly, "is but a workshop of deception. One cannot wonder that it should prove convenient to those who traffic in mischief." I had no rejoinder, for the truth of his remark seemed plain even to my less disciplined vision. As we returned toward the stage, Holmes's attention was arrested by a fleeting incident. Two members of the company, a minor actor and a woman in costume, paused in their passage across the boards. Their heads inclined closely, a whisper passed swiftly between them, and a glance, furtive and full of meaning, was exchanged before they separated with an abruptness that betrayed their consciousness of observation. To me, it seemed no more than a trifle, one of those countless confidences that must abound where men and women labour together in close quarters. Yet Holmes's gaze lingered upon them long after they had departed, his brows slightly knitted. He neither spoke nor made note, but the compression of his lips told me that the incident had impressed itself upon his mind. "It is well," he remarked at last, in that tone of understatement which with him betokened much, "to observe not only what is said, but also what is not meant to be seen." With that cryptic utterance, he turned once more to the business at hand, leaving me to wonder at what significance he could attach to so slight an occurrence. Holmes soon directed his inquiries to a burly stagehand who had been engaged in shifting scenery. With a casual air that belied his intent, he questioned the man concerning the properties of the theatre, the manner in which props were stored, the locking of cupboards, and the comings and goings of the company during rehearsals. The fellow grew visibly uneasy under Holmes's scrutiny, wiping his brow with the back of his hand and stammering in his replies. At one point, Holmes stooped to pick up a fragment of ribbon that lay near a heap of discarded canvas. He held it a moment to the light, then let it fall again with apparent indifference, though I knew well such trifles seldom escaped his calculation. His quiet deductions, though veiled in commonplace queries, seemed to press heavily upon the man, who muttered something about actors' quarrels and things best left alone. As we walked away, I ventured to remark upon the fellow's evident discomfiture. Holmes only smiled faintly. A conscience, Watson, however blunt, has a curious trick of betraying itself under pressure. His words stirred my curiosity, though their precise meaning remained beyond my grasp. Our inspection concluded, Holmes and I prepared to take our leave of the theatre. The rehearsal still continued upon the stage, the actors declaiming their lines with passionate fervour to the empty seats. As we passed into the wings, however, Holmes paused abruptly. His keen gaze was fixed upon a fold of curtain where the light fell dim. There, half concealed in shadow, I too discerned the outline of a figure, motionless and intent upon our movements. No greeting came from that watcher, nor did he advance into view. Yet his very stillness carried with it an air of hostility, as though some hidden will observed us with baleful purpose. Holmes regarded the spot a moment longer, then with deliberate calm turned away, signalling that we should proceed. Once in the open air, the fog pressed close about us again. Holmes adjusted his scarf and murmured, "There is more upon this stage than actors and scenery, Watson. Behind the curtain lurks a drama of another sort, and it is one whose ending we have yet to read." We had scarce completed our circuit of the stage when a sudden uproar broke the measured tones of rehearsal. Shouts arose from the corridor behind the scenes, mingled with the shrill cry of a woman and the hurried tramp of feet upon the boards. Holmes, ever alert to such disturbances, turned sharply, his face alight with a keen expectancy. The actors, abandoning their lines, rushed pell-mell towards the sound, their voices raised in exclamations of alarm. "Come, Watson," Holmes said in a tone that brooked no hesitation, and together we pressed through the narrow passage towards the source of the tumult. The clamour grew louder as we advanced, the harsh orders of the manager, the confused babble of frightened players, and beneath it all, the unmistakable timbre of distress. I felt within me that same cold tightening I had known upon battlefields, where each cry portended tragedy. Holmes, however, pushed forward with a swift precision that seemed to cut through the panic like a blade. In another moment, we stood before a cluster of figures gathered round a locked door, their faces pale in the dim gaslight. The door, we were told in hurried tones, was that of Miss Harcourt's dressing room. From within had come a heavy thud, followed by silence, and though repeated knocks had been given, no reply was heard. 2 stagehands strained against the handle, yet the stout oak held firm against their efforts. "Locked from the inside!" cried the manager, wringing his hands. "Heaven preserve us! What mischief is here?" Holmes pressed to the fore, his eye taking in the scratches about the keyhole, the splintered wood at the lintel. He rapped upon the panel with his knuckles, then stooped to peer beneath, but no sound came from the silent chamber. At his direction, a heavier assault was made. A bench brought crashing against the door, followed by the concerted push of several men. The frame quivered, the hinges groaned, but still the barrier resisted, as though it mocked their strength. "It will yield," Holmes remarked coolly, stepping back as if to measure the force required. "Yet observe, Watson, every instant of delay adds weight to the question. Who within profits by such a silence?" His words struck chill, and I braced myself as the final blow was delivered. With a splintering crack, the door at last gave way, swinging inward upon its broken hinge. A rush of actors and workmen pressed into the narrow chamber, but their advance was checked by the sight before them. Upon the floor, half across the rug and half upon the boards, lay a man, his face ashen, his limbs twisted in unconscious sprawl. A dark smear upon his shirt bespoke a wound, and beside him gleamed the hilt of a dagger, the blade red at the point, though dulled with stage use. A gasp went up, followed by cries of recognition. It was Bates, a stagehand of long service, known for his diligence and discretion. Miss Harcourt herself, pale as marble, clutched at the doorframe for support, her eyes wide with horror. Holmes bent swiftly, laying 2 fingers against the man's neck. "Alive, though but barely," he murmured. "See here, Watson, the blow has glanced, yet it was delivered with purpose." He indicated the dagger, its position close to the man's side. "And note, the weapon is one we have heard of already." The implication was plain, and I felt the weight of its menace settle heavily upon us all. Holmes at once set about a rapid survey of the chamber, his movements deliberate and exact. The single window stood latched, its panes unbroken. The sill bore no trace of intrusion from without. He tested the lock with a practiced hand, then turned his gaze upon the walls, the carpet, and the scant furnishings of the room. No panel showed displacement, no trap offered concealment. Even the door we had forced was stout, and its shattered bolt attested that it had been secured from within. "It is plain, Watson," he observed in a low tone, "that our man, if man there be, had no ingress by common means. And yet here lies a victim, wounded by a dagger that should have been secure." The actors crowded at the threshold, murmuring to one another, their whispers laden with speculation and dread. To them, the locked chamber seemed an emblem of supernatural malice. To me it was but another puzzle in the strange catalogue that fate had pressed upon Holmes's singular genius. He straightened, his eyes glittering. "An impossible assault, they will call it. But impossible, Watson, is a word the criminal utters when he would fain cloak his craft. It needed little imagination to perceive where suspicion would next alight. The victim had been found in Miss Harcourt's chamber, the weapon beside him one connected closely with her role. A murmur swelled among the company, glances quick and accusing fixed upon the unhappy actress. She drew back as though their eyes had wounded her more deeply than steel, and for an instant I feared she would swoon. "I knew nothing of it," she cried, her voice breaking. "I swear before heaven I had no hand in this horror." Yet her protest was met with silence, broken only by the uneasy shifting of feet. The manager, his face drawn, muttered of scandal and ruin should the truth prove as appearances suggested. Holmes, who had watched the gathering storm with cold detachment, raised a hand. "It is ever the way, Watson," he said softly enough that only I might hear, "that the simplest explanation tempts most readily, though it be the least sound. Miss Harcourt may be the target, not the cause of this design." His words, though not spoken aloud to the assembly, carried a weight that steadied me, even as suspicion pressed more cruelly upon the trembling woman. Holmes now turned his full attention to the prostrate man. Kneeling, he examined the wound with a surgeon's precision, then lifted the dagger with delicate fingers. He noted the smudge upon its hilt, the angle at which it had fallen, the faint impression of fibres clinging to its edge. Producing his lens, he scrutinized the carpet where the victim lay, tracing lightly with his hand along the nap. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "The blade was held not in the victim's grasp but another's, for the mark lies here, at the shoulder. Yet the assailant stood close, almost unnaturally so, for the thrust was downward. And here," he indicated a slight indentation in the rug, "is evidence of a heavier shoe than Bates was wont to wear." I watched in fascination as he gathered clue upon clue, each a fragment of meaning that escaped my slower perception. To the crowd, he offered no enlightenment. merely directing that the wounded man be carried to the infirmary. But in his eye, there burned a light that told me the first threads of this seemingly impossible puzzle were already taking shape in that marvellous mind. At length, the injured Bates was lifted onto a stretcher and borne away through the side entrance, his groans faint in the stillness that followed. The actors dispersed in uneasy groups, their voices low, their eyes casting frequent glances toward Miss Harcourt, who remained rooted where she stood, her features stricken with dread. The air of the theatre seemed heavy with suspicion, as though the very boards we trod were steeped in some unseen menace. Holmes touched my arm, and we withdrew quietly from the chamber. As we passed once more into the fog-laden street, I could not but feel relief at leaving behind that oppressive atmosphere. Yet my companion's face was grave, his brows drawn in deep reflection. "There is method here, Watson," he said at last, though hidden beneath layers of contrivance. "We are dealing with a mind that delights in masquerade. It will not suffice to follow appearances. We must pierce through to what lies beneath." His words stirred in me a sombre anticipation. For all my admiration of his powers, I sensed that this case, born of shadows and theatre tricks, would prove darker than any we had yet pursued. We entered the green room under a pall of tension that seemed to thicken the very air. Holmes, as ever, moved with his customary precision, noting the posture and expression of each member of the company with the intensity of a man examining a chemical experiment. The actors clustered about in small groups, whispering furtively, their faces pale, their eyes flicking toward the closed door of Miss Harcourt's dressing chamber, as if it contained some malignant force. I observed that even those most accustomed to the stage's theatrics betrayed a raw, unguarded anxiety, and in the intervals of their nervous chatter, the rustle of costumes and the faint aroma of powder mingled with the pervasive scent of stale tobacco. Holmes's gaze travelled from one to another, capturing nuances that would have escaped any ordinary observer. A clenched fist, a tremor of the lip, the sudden tightening of a jaw. It was evident that beneath the professional veneer, rivalries and petty resentments festered, waiting only for an incident such as this to surface. The stagehands, uneasy themselves, lingered near the door, muttering fragments of conjecture, their voices carrying the subtle quiver of fear. In the midst of this, Holmes remained still, his eyes sharp, his expression an inscrutable mask, as if he were already tracing invisible lines of connection among the company's anxious motions and hushed murmurs, while I struggled to anticipate the revelations that might emerge from such a gathering. Holmes directed his first scrutiny toward the celebrated actor of the company, a man whose bearing was as lofty as it was exacting, and whose presence seemed to dominate the room without effort. He rose to meet us with a courteous yet imperious inclination of the head, his eyes gleaming with the vanity that had long been whispered about behind his back. As Holmes questioned him, his replies were polished, almost rehearsed. Yet beneath the cultivated tone there flickered glimpses of temper, impatience thinly disguised as dignified authority. I noticed the quick tightening of his knuckles, the slight flicker of a nostril, and the rigid set of his shoulders whenever his superiority was subtly challenged. Holmes, with the skill of a surgeon examining a wound, pressed gently, yet insistently, drawing from him admissions that, while innocuous on their surface, hinted at deeper, more troubling emotions. Jealousy, the shadow of envy toward younger talent, the subtle hunger for dominion over both stage and company alike. There was a palpable tension in the room, for the man's pride was formidable. And yet it was evident that beneath it lay passions capable of darker manifestations, should provocation strike with sufficient force. I noted, as Holmes listened in his customary silence, that the actor's gaze darted occasionally toward Miss Harcourt's still closed door, betraying a curiosity that was at once protective, possessive, and perhaps unwholesome in its intensity. Our attention then turned to the theatre manager, a man of middling stature and nervous countenance, whose manner betrayed a constant preoccupation with the precarious balance between reputation and ruination. He spoke in careful, measured tones, revealing a financial strain that weighed heavily upon him and a fear that any scandal, especially of this nature, might topple the fragile edifice of his enterprise. Holmes's questions, precise and deliberate, elicited from him an account of accounts overdue and loans pressing with merciless inevitability, each confession delivered with the air of a man whose livelihood teetered on the brink. The scent of ink and paper, so persistent in the office where he kept his books, seemed to linger about him still, a silent testament to sleepless nights and anxious calculations. His hands, twitching nervously over one another, revealed a man driven by necessity to weigh risk in every action, and I could not but feel the strain of moral compromise pressing upon him, an unease that seemed to render him susceptible to influence or suggestion in ways both subtle and insidious. Holmes, ever the observer of minute reactions, noted the faint pallor beneath the manager's complexion, the imperceptible twitch of a nostril, the rapidity with which he blinked when questioned on the company's internal disagreements. And all these traces he recorded silently, as though committing them to a ledger of motive and circumstance invisible to the rest of us. Next came the understudy, a youth of slight build and pallid complexion, whose envious regard for Miss Harcourt had long been a matter of whispered commentary among the company. His answers to Holmes's probing were hesitant, almost tremulous, and yet beneath the tremor lay a bitterness sharpened by repeated disappointment. I noticed the way he avoided the gaze of those more senior, the subtle tension in his fingers as they toyed with the hem of his sleeve, and the occasional fleeting flash of anger in his eyes when Miss Harcourt's name was mentioned. Holmes, with a keen eye for the fissures of human temperament, allowed the young man's words and silences to speak in equal measure, recognizing the potential for malice that might fester quietly until some opportunity, however slight, presented itself. There was a sense, palpable in the green room, that resentment could easily mature into action, and the understudy's demeanour carried the unmistakable weight of a grievance held too long, a fire smouldering beneath a thin veneer of obedience and feigned humility. The very air seemed to pulse with latent hostility, and I could not but shiver at the thought of what might transpire, should such a volatile mixture of envy, ambition, and fear be stirred to sudden eruption. As the questioning continued, subtle hints of clandestine attachments became apparent, like threads of smoke curling invisibly through the company's interactions. I observed fleeting glances between members, the quiet brushing of hands, and the brief, conspiratorial lowering of voices that suggested intimacies hidden from the theatre's public eye. Holmes, silent as ever, caught each nuance with his piercing scrutiny, noting not merely the physical gestures, but the moral implications they carried, the entanglements that might distort judgment and inflame passions otherwise latent. Whispers of flirtation, murmurs of secret meetings in darkened corridors, all hinted at private jealousies that could readily spill into the realm of violence when combined with the pressure of the stage and the sudden trauma of the previous assault. I was struck by the delicate interplay of suspicion and desire, of secrecy and revelation, as though the theatre itself had become a crucible in which human motives were distilled to their most potent, dangerous essence. Each revelation, however slight, seemed to cast a longer shadow, and I could not but sense that some act yet unperformed, born of envy or passion, lay waiting just beyond the reach of our observation. Throughout the proceedings, Holmes spoke scarcely a word, his attention fixed upon the subtleties which all others overlooked. He noted the precise alignment of collars and cuffs, the slight sheen of perspiration along a brow, the nervous repositioning of a foot, and the manner in which a hand trembled ever so slightly while clutching a prop. These observations, trifling as they appeared to the casual eye, were in Holmes's mind a lattice upon which the entire sequence of human intention could be traced. At intervals, he would pause, crouching near a chair or leaning toward a whispering group, his gaze penetrating the facade of civility that each actor maintained. I watched, fascinated, as he recorded these minute traces with an almost surgical impartiality, a relentless cataloguing of the gestures and tones that might betray motive, fear, or guilt. There was a subtlety in his disquiet that unnerved the company, for one could sense, without knowing precisely why, that every action and word might be weighed and found wanting. Even the theatre manager's anxious shuffling and the understudy's envious glances were not beyond Holmes's attention, each becoming a vector in the pattern he quietly traced, while the rest of us remained blind to the emerging lattice of human inclination and suspicion. As the final questions were posed, a pervasive sense of uncertainty descended upon the company. Suspicion rested lightly, yet insistently, upon each individual in turn, leaving me unsettled by the equal plausibility of their motives. Holmes, ever composed and inscrutable, offered no counsel or guidance, yet I could perceive, in the set of his shoulders and the focus of his gaze, that the outlines of the mystery were already forming with crystalline clarity in his mind. He allowed the theatre's actors and staff to depart, their whispered conjectures trailing after them like fragments of a puzzle incomplete, while I remained to ponder the interwoven complexities of ambition, jealousy, secret liaisons, and professional pride that had been laid bare in that green room. Each detail, no matter how minute, seemed to ripple through the company's interpersonal fabric, hinting at motives as diverse as they were compelling, leaving me with the uncomfortable awareness that the assault was not the work of some random misfortune, but the inevitable expression of passions and resentments long contained. Holmes's expression remained unreadable, yet I sensed that he already comprehended the architecture of intent beneath the surface, a lattice of shadows and impulses that would soon be illuminated by his singular capacity for deduction. The theatre's corridors, hushed and still in the early afternoon, seemed unusually solemn, as though they too were aware of the undercurrent of unease that clung to the company. My companion, Holmes, moved with that characteristic precision of his, eyes sweeping over every surface with a scrutinizing care that suggested an anticipation beyond my own. It was he who, with a slight bend of the knee and the delicate manipulation of gloved fingers, retrieved from the dressing-room floor a torn scrap of the play's script. The paper, yellowed at the edges and faintly dusted with soot from the nearby stage lamps, bore an underlined sentence that, even at first glance, arrested my attention. The words seemed to pulse with a latent threat, an almost preternatural awareness of forthcoming violence. There was a particular neatness in the handwriting, yet a certain nervous unevenness, as if penned with haste under constraint. Holmes turned it between his fingers, observing it as one might a rare and dangerous insect, whilst I could not suppress a shiver of unease. The air carried the faint odour of aged wood and tallow from the stage, mingled with a subtler note of human apprehension, as if the very dust had absorbed the anxieties of those who trod these boards. Here, in this fragment abandoned upon the floor, the theatre had spoken its first cryptic syllable to us. Holmes' eyes narrowed as he held the fragment against the light filtering through the high windows. The line, stark in its simplicity, bore a curious weight. He shall fall beneath the mask before the curtain descends. The words, when read aloud, seemed almost to vibrate with ominous intent. I could not help but draw the inevitable connection to the grievous injury of the stagehand which had so recently occurred. A man struck in the shadowed wings under circumstances that defied immediate explanation. The phrasing suggested premeditation, a chilling foresight that transcended mere coincidence. Yet there was a peculiarity too, the theatrical cadence, the deliberate flourish of diction, which might render it a flourish of art rather than a confession of guilt. Holmes's gaze, however, was intent and immovable, registering the import without so much as a word. I felt the hairs upon my neck bristle, as if the very air had thickened with anticipation. Could the hand that wrote these words have plotted, even in jest, a dark mimicry of the stage? The theatre, usually a sanctuary of mirth and imagination, now appeared to me as a repository of latent peril, its walls reverberating with the echo of threats yet to be realized. As I pondered the fragment, my mind inevitably wandered into the realm of those ghostly superstitions which clings so tenaciously to theatres. Tales of malevolent spirits, of cursed plays whose every performance carries ill omen, of actors stricken suddenly by accident or malady, pressed themselves upon my imagination. Could it be that some lingering shadow of the past had entwined itself with this production, weaving its whispering influence through the living and the unsuspecting? Holmes, ever the skeptic, did not yet permit such conjecture to colour his method, but I confess that a tremor of apprehension coursed through me as I imagined unseen forces preying upon the pride and ambition of these players. Even the most rational mind might feel the weight of foreboding, for the stage, in its liminality between reality and illusion, has always been a theatre for both human folly and, it would seem, sinister accident. I felt a sudden tightening in the pit of my stomach, recalling the muttered warnings of old stagehands and the inexplicable whispers which sometimes accompanied the lowering of the curtain. Were we, I wondered, merely witnesses to misfortune, or had some deliberate hand cast the die for darker purposes? Holmes, however, remained inscrutable. He seated himself upon the edge of a low bench, the fragment delicately balanced between thumb and forefinger, eyes so intently fixed upon it that one might have suspected he was reading not the ink, but the air surrounding it. I watched as he examined the paper's edges for cuts, folds, and abrasion. He scrutinized the ink's hue and absorption, his keen vision tracing the subtle irregularities of pressure, the hesitations and emphasis of the scribe's hand. There was no hasty flourish here, but rather an undercurrent of restrained emotion, a meticulousness that betrayed a mind both methodical and impassioned. The fragment seemed, in his study, to speak a dialect of subtleties imperceptible to all but Holmes. He did not yet offer any explanation of his observations. His silence was charged, a delicate coil of intellect unspooling slowly in the shadows. I, for my part, could only surmise that each minute peculiarity was a potential cipher, and that the true import of this scrap might be less in its words than in the hand that wrote them, and the mind that guided that hand. When Holmes at last read the line aloud before the assembled company, a sudden hush fell over the green room, as if the words themselves bore a spell. Gasps, half-stifled murmurs, and furtive glances ensued, and I noted with some apprehension the anxious shifting of feet and the tightening of hands upon skirts and cuffs. Each member of the company seemed suddenly to weigh the implications of the fragment against their own private anxieties. The celebrated leading lady's face paled slightly, as if fearing the disclosure of some intimate secret. The young tenor's jaw clenched, a subtle, nervous movement that betrayed embarrassment or guilt. Even the more composed figures, accustomed to public scrutiny, could not entirely mask the stirrings of unease. The line's power lay not only in its suggestion of injury, but in the subtle revelation that the theatre itself might bear witness to hidden rivalries and unspoken passions. I could sense the tension thickening, a network of suspicions spun delicately from one trembling conscience to another, each anticipating that the next glance or remark might expose them to condemnation. I could not refrain from venturing a conjecture, speaking in tones just above the subdued hum of astonishment. I suggested that the fragment might be evidence of a deliberate conspiracy, a carefully plotted act of malevolence cloaked in theatrical flourish. Holmes, his manner unruffled, dismissed such premature conclusions with a quiet, ironic patience. "You see, Watson," he said, the corners of his mouth just hinting at a smile. "The play itself may be less fiction than confession. Yet to assume malice before the facts are assembled is to invite error." His observation struck me with both frustration and admiration, for he revealed the necessity of restraint and precision. I could see, however, that his mind was already at work, weighing the emotional tone, the peculiarity of the handwriting, the timing and placement of the fragment, each detail a piece of a mosaic I could not yet discern. The debate between my restless imagination and his measured analysis left me uneasy, acutely aware that the theatre's shadowed corners concealed both narrative and truth in equal measure. As evening descended upon the theatre, the low glow of gas lamps lending the corridors a muted amber hue, Holmes finally tucked the fragment into the inner pocket of his coat, his expression unreadable. The other members of the company retired, some casting furtive glances backward, as though the very walls might betray their secrets. I remained for a moment in the green room, absorbing the lingering sense of unease, the faint odour of ink, dust, and human apprehension mingling in the air. The scrap of paper, though small and unassuming, had deepened the riddle that encompassed us, yet its true significance eluded even my careful observation. Holmes's eyes, ever piercing and inscrutable, suggested that the clue's ultimate import was already being charted within that brilliant, unfathomable mind. I could only follow, watchful and uncertain, as the shadows lengthened across the empty benches and the theatre prepared, as if by some subtle instinct, to witness the unfolding of its own concealed truths. When the evening of the premiere at last arrived, the Strand Theatre presented a spectacle which London had seldom equalled. Carriages rattled to and fro, their lamps cutting through the mist, while an eager throng pressed about the entrance, jostling for admittance. The murmur of expectant voices, the shrill laughter of ladies wrapped in their finery, and the impatient calls of vendors combined in a curious harmony of gaiety. To the multitude, it was but another night of amusement, the promise of spectacle and diversion. To Holmes and myself, however, the occasion was fraught with a tension which robbed it of all festivity. My companion sat beside me in silence, his profile grave against the cab window. "Observe, Watson," he remarked at last, "how readily the public flocks to illusion, blind to the possibility that within those doors lies not merely a play, but a crime yet unfinished." His words chilled me, for amid the bustle and excitement, there lingered a sense of impending disclosure, as though the theatre itself were charged with some grim revelation. When at last we alighted and passed within, I felt as though we entered not into a hall of pleasure, but into a chamber of judgment. Holmes's arrangements procured us entry by the stage door, and we soon found ourselves in the shadowed labyrinth behind the curtain. Here the atmosphere changed abruptly. Gone was the laughter of the audience, replaced by the whispered urgency of actors, the creak of shifting scenery, and the subdued hiss of gas jets. The wings were dimly lit, patches of brilliance falling where lamps flared upon the boards, and the rest swallowed in obscurity. I could feel the very boards tremble beneath the tread of actors moving to and fro, each absorbed in the part they were to present before the assembled multitude. Yet there was beneath the surface bustle an undertone of unease. I marked the furtive glances exchanged, the quickened breaths, and the occasional tremor of a hand adjusting some trivial article of costume. Holmes stood motionless beside me, his sharp features carved in the half-light, every nerve alert. From beyond the curtain came the muffled roar of applause as the first act began. The orchestra struck its opening notes, and with the rising of the curtain, the illusion of theatre commenced. Yet here, in this dusky recess, the true drama was even now, preparing to unfold. The performance advanced with all the polish for which the Strand was reputed, yet to my mind each scene carried an air of sinister resemblance to the actual perils in which we were engaged. The play was one of passion and betrayal, its dialogue steeped in treachery and revenge, and I could not suppress the uneasy impression that art and life were converging upon the same dreadful theme. From my vantage in the wings, I saw Miss Harcourt move upon the stage with tragic grace, her pale features illumined by the footlights, her every gesture watched intently by the crowded house. The dagger, replaced now by a harmless imitation, was soon to play its part, and I felt my pulse quicken at the memory of the true blade, its edge once stained with human blood. The audience, rapt and unknowing, perceived but entertainment, while for us each word uttered, each glance exchanged, seemed fraught with ominous import. Holmes observed silently, his keen gaze traversing stage and wings alike, as though weighing the mimic crimes upon the boards against those more terrible realities concealed in the shadows. To me, the illusion grew oppressive, the very artifice of the play breathing menace into the air we drew. As scene succeeded scene, I perceived how intently Holmes watched not the play itself, but those engaged in its execution. The leading man, striding with imperious confidence, delivered his lines with voice resounding. Yet Holmes noted, I am certain, the tremor of his hand when his gaze strayed towards Miss Harcourt. The understudy, relegated to a minor role, lingered in the wings, his eyes fixed upon her with a mixture of longing and resentment that betrayed a storm of inward feeling. The manager, pacing restlessly at the side, affected an air of control, but his frequent startings at trifling noises revealed the depth of his anxiety. It was remarkable to observe how, beneath the gloss of performance, the true passions of each were laid bare to Holmes's scrutiny. The artifice of the stage could not disguise the fleeting gestures, the nervous twitches, the whispered asides, caught only by a mind attuned to the faintest signal. I myself was baffled, for to me all seemed equally implicated, and the tangle of suspicion thickened with every passing minute. Holmes, however, stood calm and rigid, his eyes bright with that peculiar inward fire which told me he was silently tracing the hidden path of motive and design. It was during an interlude, while the curtain fell for the change of scene, that Holmes moved at last from his place. With the unobtrusive assurance of one accustomed to command his surroundings, he stepped lightly among the stage properties, pausing here and there to adjust some trifling matter. A length of cord he loosened slightly. A trapdoor he examined, and then permitted to fall back into place. A small piece of scenery he altered by scarcely a finger's breadth. To my unpracticed eye, these actions appeared meaningless, yet his countenance, grave and intent, assured me they were anything but accidental. "Holmes," I ventured in a whisper, "what is it you seek?" He raised a finger to his lips, the faintest gleam of irony in his eye, but no word passed. I was left to wrestle with my perplexity, the sense that he was quietly weaving a net, each strand of which lay hidden from my comprehension. The bell rang, and the orchestra struck once more. Holmes resumed his place beside me, his features composed, his every nerve expectant. I knew then, with a certainty born of long association, that the trap was laid, though the prey had not yet stumbled into it. The play advanced toward its climax, and with it the atmosphere behind the curtain grew charged with a nervous electricity. Actors missed their cues, a prop was found displaced, and whispers circulated of articles mislaid or tampered with. The stagehands muttered among themselves, their eyes darting anxiously toward the wings, as though expecting fresh calamity at any instant. The audience, oblivious, responded with applause and laughter, yet in our shadowed refuge, the air grew heavy with foreboding. The leading man's voice cracked upon a line, and the understudy, lurking nearby, permitted himself a fleeting smile that vanished at once when Holmes's gaze fell upon him. Miss Harcourt, though visibly strained, carried her role with dignity, but the pallor of her cheeks betrayed the toll exacted by her ordeal. Holmes, immovable and silent, absorbed every detail: the missing prop, the misplaced costume, the whispered consultations. His eyes gleamed with the light of anticipation, as though he waited upon the inevitable misstep that would betray guilt. For myself, I could scarce restrain my agitation, for the convergence of illusion and reality pressed upon me with an almost suffocating weight, and I longed for the climax, whatever form it might assume, to break the dreadful suspense. The final act commenced amid a hush of expectancy. The stage, now set for its tragic denouement, glowed beneath the glare of footlights, while the audience leaned forward in eager attention. From the wings, I watched with a heart that beat heavily, for I knew that Holmes's quiet manipulations were about to bear their fruit. It was at a crucial moment, when the dagger, now restored to its place among the properties, was required, that the guilty party betrayed themselves. A hand, confident yet too hasty, reached for what should have been securely in its accustomed spot, and in that instant, the illusion crumbled. The alteration Holmes had made rendered concealment impossible, and the actor faltered visibly, his discomposure plain to all who observed. Holmes stepped imperceptibly forward, his keen eyes fixed upon the quivering figure, though he uttered not a word. The scene upon the stage proceeded, the audience none the wiser. Yet in the shadowed wings I understood that a silent trap had closed. Holmes, calm and assured, had drawn the line between pretense and reality, and though the revelation was not yet voiced, the criminal's mask had begun to slip beneath the merciless light of the footlights. The hush which fell upon the theatre as the curtain rose for the final act was of a quality unlike that of ordinary expectancy. The audience, leaning forward in their seats, seemed instinctively aware that more than a play was at stake, while to those of us concealed in the wings, the atmosphere was charged with a suspense that made every whispered cue, every shuffle of a foot, sound unnaturally loud. I confess that my pulse quickened in sympathy with the actors, though their lines were but words upon a page. Yet in those moments the fiction of the stage and the reality of our investigation appeared indistinguishably intertwined. Holmes, standing rigid beside me, betrayed no outward sign of agitation. But I knew by the gleam in his eye and the faint tightening of his lips that the moment toward which he had so carefully manoeuvred events was now at hand. The orchestra's strains faded to silence, the spotlight fell upon the players, and with it the scene began which was destined to unmask guilt before assembled hundreds. The play demanded a moment of high treachery in which one character would seize a dagger concealed behind the arras. All eyes, both of audience and company, turned towards that familiar corner where the property had been restored. Yet as the actor's hand stole forth, another, swifter hand preceded it, belonging not to the character appointed by the script, but to the very man whose conscience had trembled these many days. To the spectators it may have seemed but a minor irregularity, yet to Holmes and myself it was the fatal gesture of one betrayed by his own cunning. For Holmes, anticipating the attempt, had altered the prop's place in such a way that none but one acquainted with its secret hiding could have reached for it with confidence. In that instant, the mask of pretense slipped. The man faltered, his face blanching beneath the glare of the footlights, his words stumbling from his tongue. A murmur swept the audience at the oddity of his lapse, but Holmes's eyes were already upon him with the merciless steadiness of justice itself. What to others was trivial was to my companion the sign unmistakable of guilt revealed. Holmes advanced 2 paces from the shadow of the wings, his figure half illumined by the light from the stage. With a firm gesture of the hand he commanded silence, and so compelling was his presence that both players and audience alike fell into a breathless stillness. His voice, cool and resonant, carried easily to every corner of the theatre. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what you have witnessed is no slip of memory, but the collapse of an illusion most carefully contrived. A man lies wounded in this theatre, seemingly by a hand that could not enter, a chamber barred against intrusion. Yet the trick, like all stagecraft, depended on the manipulation of props and scenery. A door secured from within, a falsehood, for a trap, cunningly built into the dressing-room panelling, allowed ingress and egress, as invisible to the casual eye as the sleights of hand you applaud upon this very stage." A ripple of astonishment passed through the gathering. Holmes turned, his keen gaze fixed unwaveringly upon the guilty man, who stood frozen, his pallor deepening with each syllable that fell from those incisive lips. Holmes's voice grew more inexorable as he proceeded, each phrase cutting away the last shred of concealment. "You, sir," he said, "possess both the knowledge of this contrivance and the motive to employ it. You alone rehearsed here long after the others had gone. You alone stood to gain by the discredit and ruin of Miss Harcourt, whose place upon the stage threatened your ambition. The dagger was no apparition. It was stolen by your hand, hidden by your cunning, and employed in your desperate design to destroy by terror what you could not subdue by merit." The accused trembled visibly, his lips moving soundlessly as Holmes laid bare each element of his stratagem. The false notes slipped into Harcourt's room. The whispers spread amongst the company. The careful exploitation of stage machinery to mimic the impossible. The actors looked on in astonishment, while the audience, held in thrall, scarcely breathed. To me, it was as if I beheld a man stripped of every veil, the naked truth of envy and malice glaring from his countenance, no longer disguised by the artistry of his role. For a moment longer, he strove to maintain his composure, but the effort was beyond his strength. With a cry that echoed horribly through the hushed theatre, he flung the dagger from his hand, the blade clattering across the boards with a metallic ring. His features contorted between rage and despair, he staggered forward, grasping at the air as though to clutch the tatters of his collapsing pretense. Then, overcome by the weight of exposure, he sank upon his knees, his words issuing in a torrent of broken confession. Yes, he had plotted it all, driven by jealousy of Miss Harcourt, by the bitter knowledge that her fame had eclipsed his own. The threats, the vanished weapon, the locked room, all had been staged with the cruel ingenuity of one who lived by illusion and sought to turn that craft to darker ends. His voice rose, cracked, and fell to silence. There was a stir among the company, some shrinking back in fear, others transfixed in horrified fascination. The audience, bewildered, half believed this outburst a part of the play, though a dreadful chill soon told them it was grim reality. The theatre had dissolved into confusion when the manager, pale but resolute, stepped forward to restore order. "Enough!" he cried, his voice quivering, yet imbued with authority. At Holmes's signal, 2 constables who had been stationed discreetly among the crowd advanced and secured the prisoner, their firm hands lending finality to the collapse of his schemes. The man, now broken, offered no further resistance, but allowed himself to be led away, his head bowed in abject defeat. The company, relieved yet shaken, clustered together in hushed consultation. Some wept openly, others exchanged whispers that betrayed more curiosity than grief. Miss Harcourt, her pallor touched with a faint flush, stood motionless, as though scarcely able to comprehend her deliverance. The audience, uncertain still whether they had witnessed fact or performance, applauded timidly, then fell to murmuring in bewilderment. Never had illusion and reality been so intermingled upon those boards, and many departed with the uneasy sense that life's darker dramas had thrust themselves rudely upon the mimic stage. Holmes, meanwhile, gave but a slight inclination of the head, his work completed, his thoughts already withdrawn to that realm of quiet reflection wherein his true triumphs lay. Later, in the comparative seclusion of the manager's office, Holmes consented to reveal the last strands of the puzzle. He spoke without flourish, in tones of quiet exposition, while I listened with the mingled awe and relief that always attended his solutions. "The trick of the locked chamber," said he, "was nothing more than the employment of a disused panel, built to allow the shifting of scenery, yet concealed so cleverly that it deceived even those accustomed to the theatre's structure. Our criminal, versed in the minutiae of his surroundings, seized upon it to simulate impossibility. But deception, Watson, is like a poorly set stage. It will collapse under the weight of its own artifice when pressed by reason." I marvelled at the elegance of his reasoning, and confessed my inability to discern the truth amid so many distractions. Holmes smiled faintly, his gaze turned inward. "It is the essence of the stage, my dear fellow, to mingle illusion with reality. Tonight we have but torn aside the gauze. The play is ended, yet the lesson remains, that envy and ambition will write tragedies more relentless than any playwright." Thus he concluded, his triumph quiet, his irony profound. The following evening found us once more in the quiet seclusion of Baker Street. The roar of the Strand Theatre, with its lights, whispers, and passions, seemed now a world removed from the tranquil glow of our familiar sitting room. A steady fire burned upon the hearth, throwing its flicker across the well-ordered litter of chemical apparatus, monographs, and newspapers that marked Holmes's peculiar kingdom. Outside, the city's bustle ebbed into muffled tones, the rattle of wheels softened by the fog that pressed against the windows. Holmes sat in his accustomed armchair, pipe in hand, his lean figure drawn into the shadows, while I, still restless from the drama of the night before, gazed at him with a mixture of curiosity and awe. He had been silent since our return, yet I knew well that his silence was not vacancy, but the brooding distillation of thought. At length, he stirred, casting a glance towards me. "You desire, Watson, that the threads be gathered. Very well. Let us lay them out one by one and see how a riddle of shadows dissolves beneath the plain light of fact." Holmes began in that deliberate tone with which he was wont to unfold his chain of reasoning. "We must start with the threats. The anonymous notes, grotesque in phrase and crude in design, were but the opening chord in a symphony of deception. Their purpose was never to terrify alone, but to establish an atmosphere of dread about Miss Harcourt, thereby rendering the later contrivances more credible. The vanished dagger was the second movement, a simple theft, but executed with theatrical timing, so that its sudden reappearance in her dressing room should carry the aura of the uncanny. And lastly, the scrap of script with its underlined sentence, an artful flourish designed to suggest a fate preordained, when in truth it was no more than a deliberate plant by the guilty hand. He drew upon his pipe, the smoke wreathing like thought made visible. Thus, each fragment, threat, weapon, and cryptic line was not isolated, but successive, each preparing the stage for the next. Our criminal composed them as carefully as an actor rehearses his role, counting upon the credulity of his fellows to supply the supernatural where only trickery lay concealed. Holmes leaned forward, his long fingers steepled. "Now, as to the dressing room. You recall, Watson, the door secured from within, the absence of broken pane or hidden passage, the very image of the impossible. Yet the stage is a house of contrivances, and to one who knows its architecture, illusion is second nature. A sliding panel, once used for shifting scenery, had been cunningly adapted to open behind the wardrobe. From this aperture, the assailant could enter noiselessly, strike his blow and retreat, leaving the door and window untouched. When the company forced their way in, they found precisely what was intended, the tableau of impossibility." He permitted himself the faintest smile. "It is the oldest of stratagems, Watson, to persuade men that a puzzle lies beyond reason, when in truth it rests upon the simplest of mechanisms. The locked room mystery was no marvel of fate, but a trick of carpentry, well hidden and ill suspected. Once seen, it is as transparent as the painted scenery of the stage when viewed by daylight. Yet, in the half-light of fear, it imposed upon all save those willing to test appearance against fact." Holmes resumed, his tone now colder, as though the very recital of motive carried with it a distaste. "The hand that penned the notes, stole the dagger, and crept through the hidden panel was driven not by madness, nor yet by the thirst for blood, but by that more insidious passion, envy. The understudy, embittered by perpetual subordination, saw in Miss Harcourt's triumph the reflection of his own obscurity. Add to this the terror of financial ruin, debts pressing with relentless urgency, and you have the combustible elements of despair." He tapped the ash from his pipe. It was a curious stratagem. To destroy the actress by surrounding her with suspicion, to shake her nerves, ruin her reputation, and seize her place. The wounded stagehand was but an accident of opportunity, a pawn employed to give reality to the fiction. What might appear to the credulous as ghostly vengeance was, in sober fact, the miserable device of a jealous man who sought to wield illusion as a weapon. Thus, the very tools of his trade became instruments of crime, and the stage itself his accomplice. I could not restrain a gesture of astonishment as he concluded. "Holmes," I exclaimed, "I confess myself utterly at fault. At every turn the evidence appeared to point to some malignant force beyond human design. The whispers, the vanished weapon, the cryptic prophecy, all bore the stamp of something supernatural. I was prepared to credit the theatre with a curse, rather than believe such careful contrivance lay behind it." He regarded me with that mingled amusement and indulgence I had so often provoked. "My dear Watson, you represent the natural mind, honest, impressionable, swayed by the surface. It is no reproach. Indeed, without such a mind, the deceiver would have no audience. But the detective must strip illusion bare as the surgeon lays open a wound to reveal the mechanism beneath. Ghosts and curses are but the masks which envy and ambition assume to terrify the credulous. Once the mask is torn away, the human face, however ignoble, stands revealed. I bowed to his superior logic, though my heart still clung to the awe I had felt in the theatre's shadowed corridors, where illusion and reality had mingled until even reason itself seemed but a wavering flame. Holmes rose, pacing slowly before the fire, his hands clasped behind him. The theatre, Watson, is the very temple of illusion. Men and women labour endlessly for a handful of moments in which strangers bestow their applause. That sound, fleeting and intangible, becomes to them a substance more vital than bread. Yet the clapping dies, the curtain falls, and what remains? Debt, rivalry, and the gnawing dread that one's hour of triumph is already passing into another's grasp. He paused, his profile thrown into sharp relief by the firelight. It is vanity, Watson, but of a sort so potent that it has driven kings to folly and actors to crime. Fame, unlike gold, cannot be stored. It must be replenished daily, and every rival is a thief of one's portion. Our culprit, poor wretch, was less villain than victim of that insatiable hunger. His envy, sharpened by want, became at last desperation, and desperation, when cloaked in cunning, is but crime waiting for its cue. I listened in silence, struck by the sombre truth of his words, and by the melancholy cadence with which he delivered them, as though he spoke not of the theatre alone, but of life itself. Holmes sank once more into his chair, the faintest smile touching his lips. The fire crackled softly, and the steady tick of the clock marked the silence that followed his reflections. At length he spoke, his tone low, almost contemplative. The theatre is but a mirror of life, Watson. On both stages, men will kill for the merest applause. Strip away the grease paint and the curtain, and you find the same passions, envy, vanity, ambition, that play out in every chamber of human endeavour. I could not forbear a shudder, recalling the pale face of Miss Harcourt, the despairing cry of the unmasked actor, the dagger glinting under the pitiless lamps. Yet Holmes's words struck deeper still, for they revealed not merely a crime of jealousy, but a truth of mankind, that the desire for recognition, however fleeting, may outweigh honour, friendship, or mercy. Holmes closed his eyes, drawing upon his pipe, the smoke wreathing upwards in delicate spirals. "It is well, Watson," he murmured, "that applause fades, else men would never cease their striving, and the world would be but one endless stage." With that reflection, he sank into silence, and the case was at an end. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the last curl of smoke rising from his pipe as his gaze settled upon the fire. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "the stage deceives only because men are so willing to be deceived. The trick was no more ingenious than many I have encountered, but it found its strength in vanity and envy, those ancient passions that never tire of donning new costumes. The true illusion was not in the locked room, but in the hearts of those who believed it unassailable. And now I turn the question to you. What do you think was the criminal's greatest mistake, his reliance on stagecraft, or his failure to reckon with human nature? Let me know your thoughts below. If you enjoyed this mystery, share it with others who delight in Holmes's deductions, and remember to subscribe so you never miss another case from the master of Baker Street.